Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to another episode of Sci-Fi. It's a show on Subbation Media about psychoanalysis and psychotherapy and its intersections with politics. We're out every Friday, so happy Friday, everyone. People should also check out our other episodes, our playlists. We've had some great people on, Jodie Dean, Jameson Webster, etc., and excited to have Mladen Dolar next week. And very excited to have with us today Samo Tomšič, obviously extremely well-known Slovene Lacanian school psychoanalytic theorist, author of The Capitalist Unconscious with Verso, and more recently than that, this great book, The Labour of Enjoyment, which we'll be talking about a little bit today, which came out maybe 2 years ago. And then he's now working on questions of capitalist antisociality, which we also talked about with Matthew Flisfader last week. So people can check out that. Thanks for joining us today, Samo. How are you getting on?
Lovely. Sorry, that's a rough beginning. Lovely to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I'm good.
Great. I mean, let's start with with your first book and how it sort of frames your work and stuff, because one of the things that we've come up against in our discussions with people, we're always getting criticized by Marxists for being too Lacanian and so on, or we're always hearing that Lacanian and maybe even broader psychoanalysis isn't the ally of Marxism and so on. But your first book, was really about addressing this and arguing that psychoanalysis, and in particular Freud and Lacan, should be considered, the great allies of Marx, right? And so tell us about that, broad approach that you took.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would, I guess, lay my cards on the table and just admit that this book, or everything that I did around this entire issue, Marx and Lacan, or Marxism and psychoanalysis, or critique of political economy and psychoanalysis, is a biased reading. I mean, I don't think one can have a non-biased position in this field. And also, I would say that criticisms of psychoanalysis for being, kind of therapy for the poor bourgeois subject and so on and so forth, or Eurocentric and so on. I mean, it's all true, but at the same time, I think it's a criticism that excludes the attempts of radicality in both Freud and Lacan. If we now just remain restricted to these two names, which are both great discontinuities in the history of psychoanalysis, much bigger. I mean, Freud, of course, the inventor, is a discontinuity, but Lacan's return to Freud is a return to a radical kernel of psychoanalysis, and it was already a very very biased reading of Freud against the liberal appropriations that took place, particularly in the Anglo-American sphere, or the more positivist turn of psychoanalysis in the German-speaking world. So, and then entering in this peculiar thesis that Lacan made eventually after May 68, that there is a homology between Freud's critique of pleasure, or critical theory of pleasure, and Marx's theory of surplus value, kind of opened up a horizon which didn't remain restricted only to this one aspect that Lacan tackled. It just started to kind of proliferate to the theory of the unconscious, to the drive, to the question of subjectivity, social bond, and so on and so forth. So,
yeah, great. I mean, and then let's maybe come on to enjoyment then, because one of the things you do in this kind of second book is to think about how enjoyment is the kind of sort of fuel for capitalism, I suppose. And so you sort of and really the book is, I mean, this is a book that in a sense it's a theoretical intervention, but it's also about capitalist politics, and in particular identity politics, right? So, I mean, one of the things I was really interested in, this idea of, sort of like identity is an attempt to resolve contradiction, right? So like how capitalism turns subjects into identities and things like that you deal with. So, what do you, I mean, tell us your sort of why you see enjoyment as being like at the center of capitalist system, but also what do you think about like capitalism and identity politics in this kind of current political moment?
Well, I guess every social order or every social bond is already a libidinal bond. I guess that's one of the most valuable lessons of Freudian psychoanalysis or Freud's work already, but much more nuanced and also much more antagonistically framed than in predecessors, like, for instance, Nietzsche. I mean, Nietzsche, with his theory of resentment or ressentiment, doesn't claim anything other than this, that there is a certain lustfulness in the generation and reproduction of resentment, and that this is ultimately a social bond. But I think if we take Lacan seriously and his introduction, forging of the notion of surplus enjoyment, surplus jouissance, then I think we have to see in this concept itself a thesis regarding the specifically capitalist organization of enjoyment. So differently put, there is no surplus enjoyment before or outside capitalism. Maybe some fellow Lacanians would disagree with this historicist reading of Lacan, but I think the problem of history of enjoyment or metamorphosis of enjoyment was one of the crucial issues since Freud. I mean, his theory of the drive, his theory of Lust has always addressed the historicity also in terms of polymorphism, transformations, transformability of enjoyment. I think this has a temporal dimension to it, which has social has this social dimensionality as well. So I mean, I recall spontaneously this remark by Freud, which is in a footnote in his 3 essays on theory of sexuality, where he says that the ancients placed the accent on the drive's activity, whereas us, the moderns, place the accent on the object, as if, the drive activity would otherwise be something filthy or forbidden or unworthy of the human subject. But I think, if we take this remark by Freud seriously, it actually plays well in Lacan's thesis that in modernity, enjoyment becomes quantified, countable, subject of object of an economic, particularly calculus and exchange and extraction, of course. And that is surplus enjoyment. Surplus in the sense that it counts and it kind of proliferates, grows, and also obtains a certain out of control, unbound reality. Uncontrollable.
I mean, it makes me want to ask about these. I'm sure you've seen sort of current discourses around what sometimes gets called emotional labor or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So you get, complaints, for example, some people complaining, quite rightly, I'm sure, about working conditions and saying, well, part of the problem here is that it's not just labor, but it's my emotional labor. I was thinking of a film, Zero Fucks Given. I don't know if you've seen this film. It's about air hostesses and the amount of emotional labor that air hostesses have to do to keep a smile on their face and entertain the customer and so on. But in a sense, your argument in this it kind of counters that discourse, because you're essentially saying that all labor in capitalism contains enjoyment, right? And the libidinal, one of capitalism's functions or powers, let's say, is to build emotional and enjoyment and into the labor process itself. Would that be right?
Yes, that would be right. I mean, I would say that in capitalism, enjoyment becomes one of the essential forms of laboring for the system. But of course, enjoyment in this Freudian sense, in the sense of Lust, which I think the most correct translation of this term into English would be lust. So it's, you know the story. Lust being at the same time something pleasurable and unpleasurable. Or a form of pleasure characterized by the fact that it's not experienced as pleasurable. That cannot be experienced as as such.
One thing you wrote in the Marx Lacan book, this one.
This one.
This one. You know, this one with the iconic cover one. Is that you called it, the first thing you said is a bias reading, but it didn't really come across as biased. It kind of, I thought it did a good job of explaining the kind of continuity of lust or this Freudian subject as labor, in terms of there is this kind of labor in enjoyment itself, and then there's the capitalist subject that exudes or forecloses all negativity, and kind of what you're left with is like this modern anti-psychoanalytic subjectivity. Can I ask you, why does capitalism exclude negativity? Does it really exclude negativity?
Well, that's the thing. Does it really exclude negativity? I mean, the entire psychoanalysis is shouting, no, it doesn't. I mean, it's
right.
Negativity is characterized by the fact that it returns as a distortion or as a discontinuity. Right. Structure and so on. So basically, I mean, already this Lacanian thesis that Marx invented the notion of the social symptom actually implies that capitalism cannot be thought without this generation of a specifically capitalist negativity that is the social symptom or the subject. And there are several social symptoms. Of course, I mean, for Marx, the privileged social symptom was the proletarian. We can add a lineup of social symptoms: the woman, the colonial subject, the slave or enslaved, the so-called global South, the trans subjectivity today, and so on and so forth. And this is where we maybe get back to this issue of identity politics that Alfie has indicated earlier. You know, it's I think I guess what's happening today is that identity politics, in its liberal or whitewashed liberal appropriation, became entirely integrated into this kind of relation of competitiveness, which is the only social bond that capitalism ultimately allows. Right. And the systemic affect of this social bond cannot be other than resentment. So this, I guess, is the limit of identity politics in the present state. I'm not talking about the historical identity politics, which is much more on the side of the social symptom and is aware of the fact that political subjectivity is, first of all, relational and in solidarity with other social symptoms and with other emancipatory struggles, and does not exist outside this relation of solidarity, which then also is accompanied with a different set of affects. And I would even say perhaps that solidarity is an affect. It's not just sort of innocent posture towards the other. It's actually an affect in which we are confirmed in the simultaneity of our identity and non-identity, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. And to say that solidarity is an affect is an important sort of psychoanalytic lesson about politics, to my mind, because, you know, it's important for politics to be libidinal. They precisely function in a libidinal way, and they function divisively like that. So they can also function in a sort of solidarity sense via affect. It's not that. Because, I mean, one could imagine someone objecting and saying that politics shouldn't be about emotions and impulse, but in fact, it kind of has to be, right?
Yeah, I mean, depending on what we understand under emotion or affect or enjoyment. I mean, of course, these are three different notions which point to three different complexities of states, and also of the relation between the mental and the corporeal, as Freud would put it. But definitely, I mean, I would say one of the most valuable and also anti-liberal, perhaps, lessons of psychoanalysis is that thought is affect. And that this identity of thought and affect also brings to the point a decentered status of the subject, or split, divided. And precisely in this respect, it counters this fantasized subjectivity that economic and political liberalism have been promoting throughout the past few centuries.
I mean, I absolutely. I mean, tell us. I mean, on this question of identity and so on, identity politics and so on. I mean, part of what you're working with is a kind of distinction, or you're using a distinction in your argument between subject and identity, right? Or subjectivity. And just take us through why you're like opposing those things and what that distinction is.
Subject and identity. I mean, you know, I always found it quite telling that Freud. And Lacan anyway, didn't speak about identity, but of identification, which kind of, I think, would stand for something like a mediating term between the subject and identity. And I mean, you know very well that also the notion of the subject has been, up to Lacan, actually, a very much idealized entity, and didn't have these features that the Lacanian subject has. I mean, the entire criticism of the notion of the subject that arose, with Heidegger, but Heidegger had a different agenda with it, but particularly with structuralism and this move beyond the notion of the subject that post-structuralism then pursued. And Lacan was part of this movement. I mean, he does move beyond the subject, but the aim of this agenda was precisely to kind of pinpoint this kernel, this overlooked kernel of human subjectivity, that the notion of the transcendental subject, or homo economicus, or homo legalis, or also the notion of identity, or this empiricist subject of cognition, and so on and so forth, rejected from the consideration, except for perhaps in some outbursts in Kant and of course Hegel. But the dominant line, or let's say the normalizing line in the history of philosophy, understood the subject as a solidified entity rather than as a divided. As an entity which includes a bond, or which is a bond, or is a relation.
Yeah, and this is precisely what you're saying capitalism tries to avoid, right? It tries to turn this subject into something without contradiction, and which isn't characterized by this bond, and thinks of itself as a sort of identity instead.
Well, I mean, I think a crucial part of exploitation, or of reproduction, of reproducing relations of exploitation, at least in relation to certain type of societies, particularly, white European or Northern liberal or societies which we post-French Revolution. I think planting or promoting these idealized theories of human subjectivity contains something deeply hypocritical. It's kind of planting an ideal which is never possible to actualize, to realize. Right. So we are always, like a hamster on a wheel, chasing this carrot of ideal subjectivity that we cannot put into practice. We cannot live it. But like I said, I think this is an ideal which has a certain function only in specific societies.
Yeah, not like an inevitable.
Yeah. When you say that, it reminds me of kind of Rousseau's subjectivity and his kind of flowery writing, and the kind of contradiction of him like desperately reaching out to Hume via letters and kind of being curved by Hume in terms of like his it's like how can this like reconcile within his writing? I mean, his writing is obviously like an idyllic writing within a certain society that functions in a certain way, right? Yeah. You maybe Alfie, this would be a good time to ask about capitalist antisociality.
Yeah, go ahead.
Although you probably, the Mobius strip and all that, we've been talking about it the entire time, of course. But maybe it's good to to add the signifier. You said a bit that you were working on lately, this kind of concept of capitalist antisociality. Is this different than kind of these idyllic subjects that you talk about, or the kind of private libidinal economies that we're all kind of supposed to have? Is this capitalist antisociality, or is
no, actually, on the contrary, it's nothing private. It's something publicly or systemically externalized.
I'm glad I asked the right question by misunderstanding it completely.
Contradictions. I think capitalism doesn't hide, already historically that it's a system of organized antisociality, or kind of enforcement of antisocial impulses, practices, affects, and modes of enjoyment. I think also this might be one of the another shared problem of critique of political economy and psychoanalysis, at least in Marx's and Freud's framework. I think the most evident expression of antisociality in Marx's mature work is precisely fictitious capital, and this kind, or the very idea of surplus value as an economic category which needs to be uncoupled from every reinvestment in the social context, and social context being here precisely the improvement of life conditions for all, or which would actually abolish the very idea of surplus value if it would be reinvested, not in order to keep the production for the sake of production running, but be embedded in something like a production for the sake of whatever improvement of life conditions, or today environmental conditions, and so on and so forth. So this very idea of production for the sake of production, I think, is Marx's way of claiming or of spelling out that there is a radically antisocial core of in the capitalist organization of production. It cannot be otherwise. Capitalism cannot be social, or there is no social economy. The very idea of social economy doesn't make sense in capitalism.
Yeah, and part of that is part of that your earlier points about alienation, and how there's a certain, among certain theorists, there's or politicians indeed, there's a desire to overcome alienation, but actually your perspective is one has to accept the necessity of alienation and live in it and with it.
Well, yeah, because I think this notion of alienation has been very burdened by this set of negative connotations like loss of the self, which again, it's what self is lost, or deprivation, which also implies, that something which could potentially complete me as a social being or as a human subject has been lost, and so on and so forth. There in Freud, it's very clear from the very beginning that he's in line with previous attempts to think alienation as a subjective drama, of course, and also something that is very directly linked with the damaging impact of modern epistemo-economic condition on the human subject. But at the same time, he's trying to think a structure of subjectivity that that is anchored beyond this divide on completeness and incompleteness, and which also thinks the subject as historicity, or as history, as a history of transformations. And if there is a spot where there is a certain crypto-Hegelianism in Freud or in psychoanalysis, it is precisely in this equation of the unconscious with history. Of course, a conflicted history, a divided history, an antagonism. But I think, or if we take Lacan, for instance, his notion of metonymy, or of the way he introduces the notion of difference in his theory of the subject. Difference is precisely what expresses the component of temporality and of historicity at the core of the subject, of the unconscious. But of course, it kind of has this abstract or static impact on the mind, if we say difference, I guess thinking the subject as a differential function is what is at stake in psychoanalysis.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it'd be interesting to talk about what the clinical is and what clinical means in this regard, because I mean, we've I think we've been noticing recently a little bit of some interesting politics going on with clinical psychoanalysis. Let's say we interviewed some people from Brazil who work in like this kind of red clinic, which is this kind of attempt to turn clinical psychoanalysis into a kind of Marxism. We also talked to Dorothea Pospiehauge about Nina Kranic and the clinical psychoanalyst who's critical of theory, running for president of Slovenia and so on. So there's all these ways in which, and one of the things you write about in your books is the politics of the clinic, let's say. But obviously you yourself are very much a psychoanalytic theorist from this kind of Slovene school. So, how do you see this connection between the theory and the practice, and what's going on with the kind of politicization of this kind of discourse at the minute?
Well, but you see, I've been following to some extent the clinical practice in Latin America, and I mean, I'm sure that psychoanalysis is antagonized and divided there as much as it is elsewhere on the planet. But from my observer's perspective, I get the impression that psychoanalysis in Latin America is predominantly left and predominantly, kind of works on the alliance between, with critique of capitalism, discourses on decolonization, and so on and so forth. So if historically the liberal appropriation of psychoanalysis prevailed, these developments in Latin America show precisely that there cannot be other than a biased appropriation of psychoanalysis, and that there is no neutral, abstract, pure clinical expertise which would then know some left and right or liberal and conservative and more consistently left deviations. I think this is one of the most dangerous aspects of the development of psychoanalysis in Europe, for instance. And you mentioned Nina Krajnik, the Slovenian Millerian, who's now a candidate the presidential elections, of course, only in order to organize a specific set of affects which are pertaining to alt-right and to neoconservatism and to or extreme right, which was basically in power up until recently. So she doesn't have a real chance of winning, but that's also not the point. The point is that she organizes affects. And she does. I mean, she assumes, and she's not the only one here. I think this is the tragedy of the Millerian influence in École de la Post-Freudienne and beyond. That while thinking that, or while claiming that the function of the psychoanalyst assumes a position which is radical but not fitting in these conventional political divisions,
right.
They actually allied themselves with neoconservatives. Yes. And I mean, we can just look at Miller's contributions in Le Point, which have been consistently neoconservative.
Yeah, I mean, as a clinical practitioner myself, I've always been highly aware of the anti-radicality of being a psychotherapist or psychoanalyst. And I mean, one of the powerful things about a venue like this is we can organize with other people. And, in contrast to somebody who's like, Jordan Peterson, who's the man on the town with the Patreon money, right?
Yeah.
I always felt like what I was doing was better than what Jordan Peterson was doing because it's less than it. In terms of I'm integrated into other people in a much more kind of profound way where I'm allowed to have lack. I'm allowed to have lack of knowledge. And this is a profound difference. And this is an important aspect of psychoanalysis, right? I mean, of course, you should look at a psychoanalyst with skepticism. You should look at anybody who talks about what is mentally healthy with skepticism, and you should be able to analyze it, right? I mean,
yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, this entire issue of theory and practice and this controversy, can someone who's a theorist and not even having a psychoanalytic formation deal with psychoanalysis or not? I think this is the inversion of the polemic that Freud was engaged in. Can someone practice psychoanalysis without being trained in medicine, in positivist medicine?
Right.
There's this. You remember this entire engagement of Freud about the question of lay analysis. And today, I mean, I don't think anyone from the Slovenian schools or so-called Slovenian school and beyond, all the sympathizers for the psychoanalytic cause, which are not analysts, are doing wild psychoanalysis. I don't think so. I think wild psychoanalysis is being done by analysts who claim that there is this moment of purity of clinical experience, which is impenetrable for anyone else, and thereby enforce some sort of psychoanalytic esoterics. These people are much more forgetful of the fact that Lacan taught us to think psychoanalysis beyond its clinical frames as a certain social bond, as a certain social function, and that it's not about wildly applying psychoanalytic contents to everything, political while being the analyst who's authorized to do so. It's more about assuming a position which allows us to have a certain view, a certain formal view of reality in which we are embedded. So psychoanalysis can antagonize us in our rootedness in the social reality, which affects us the way it does. Just to add, I think once Lacan started speaking about psychoanalysis as a social bond, this already implies that psychoanalysis as a social bond, is broader than the clinical dispositive or clinical practice.
Yeah,
it can shake beyond the couch, so to speak. It doesn't mean that that this idea of psychoanalysis as a social bond implies, now we will have to invent a society which is grounded on the analytic discourse and so on and so forth. It means only that, or if we are modest, if we don't want to be over speculative, it means that every attempt in esoterization of psychoanalysis, if I may use this ugly term, is a betrayal of the psychoanalytic cause. Psychoanalysis transmits itself beyond the analytic cabinet, and I think that's the most valuable thing, that we can take from Lacan.
Yeah, I think this goes back to what you were saying earlier about the question of the left and the right. I think it's interesting how psychoanalysis cuts across these things, and I think that we're often under the illusion that psychoanalysis is part of leftist or Marxist discourse or something, rather than something that can kind of be separate from those things. And I think that what you just described, this kind of idea of psychoanalysis, this wrong idea of psychoanalysis as speaking from this position of authority, you see this a lot on the so-called left or the liberal side of online discourse or whatever. And what you described earlier about the way in which subjectivity gets turned into identity and so on, this is also not like banished to the realm of conservatism or right wing. This is what lots of the liberal left is doing, and it's speaking with authority and diagnosing things as identity, removing the contradiction from it, and naming things as identities. And this is this is the wrong way of using psychoanalysis, right?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And naming things, naming subjectivities as identities. Also, sorry for repeating myself. Brings about the wrong externalization of the conflictuality that drives production of subjectivity in capitalism. Because then, again, I think this is the function of liberalism. It externalizes these or transforms the real antagonisms into relations of competition, which are imaginary. They're not symbolically real to jargonize in Lacanian. They're imaginary symbolic, because it's all a question of superficiality and competitiveness. It toxifies difference. That's the point.
That's the antisocial aspect, is it?
Well, that's what's feeding in this entire antisocial nexus of capitalism, of course, because this universalization of relations of competition is, this is the base of antisociality. Where you cannot you are being educated into relating to difference only in terms of toxicity. You only perceive difference as toxic or as a threat or whatever. But just to return back a little bit to this issue, theory and practice in psychoanalysis, because I think this needs to be repeated over and over again, not only for psychoanalysts who are hostile towards theoreticians of psychoanalysis, but also for ourselves, that the most valuable thing in psychoanalysis is precisely that this entire division of theory and practice doesn't make sense. It's not, you can't say, there's theoretical psychoanalysis, like there's theoretical physics, and then there's practical or applied psychoanalysis, which is the clinical psychoanalysis, which is the application of the theory or whatever, or which is, I think, I'm not surprised whenever I read Lacan that he was interested in experimental sciences because psychoanalysis did produce or did ground itself on a certain type of experimentation which has no comparison in other experimental sciences. And this specific character of psychoanalytic experimentation is tied to the fact that there is a continuum, or that there is a certain indifference between theory and practice. We can't say, whether Freud, his two main hypotheses, the unconscious and the drive, whether they're only speculations or whether they are real phenomena. It doesn't make sense to speculate about this because they both operate, and they are both theoretical constructions and lived experiences, if I may appropriate Fanon's expression.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, what do you, as our resident therapist, Eliot, what are your thoughts on this kind of theory practice thing? I mean, you're
well, I mean, I did something that literally no one was asking for, but some people do like it. Like I really tried to write the first time I tried to write a theory book, I tried to write Zizek in the clinic. Of course, Zizek was not asking for this. And like, how do you apply Zizek in a clinical setting? What is the role? And ultimately that, I talked about how psychoeducation kind of is part of the mental health practice, and kind of the very humble job of a practitioner is somebody who's coming to you for mental health reasons, which means you're doing kind of two things. One is you're defining what mental health is going to be dialectically with that person. And two, you're kind of doing this process, which will eventually, ideally, then they will see that there's improvement, right? So I don't think that's like, I think my view of the clinical practice is it should be a lot simpler and more humble. And in terms of this theory, to think that the subject, talking about damaged subjectivity of psychoanalysis, of competitiveness, of Freud's original circle, kicking out people that did said one thing different than his ideas, like this is part of capitalist subjectivity, right? Freud needed to make money. Freud needed to be, somewhere in the institution. But I mean, I think that there's a core operation of clinical practice, which is the defining and positivistic change in mental health through various kind of analyses of contradictions and subjectivities, right? I don't think clinical practice it's not that special. And obviously, there's lots of other things that can do this operation, which is if you are to immediately kind of at hand say, I'm going to understand myself as having mental health, which is already kind of like an ideal. And then I'm going to see what would improve this kind of ideal in my kind of reflection, right? It is this process of identification, which is, has a lot to do with the imaginary. And I think that working in tandem and by, I think, clinicians recognizing that there is power, right? This is where Zizek's important. There is power when somebody comes to you and says, help me improve my mental health. You are structurally somebody, right? And you can't overcome that. So in the Zizek in the Clinic book, I wrote about this entire process of how do you get from this to mental health, what I said before, which was defining an improvement in mental health is no longer, you're not in this room with me because I'm this structural person, but rather you are, in touch with the operation of the improvement of mental health. I don't think people do this. Nobody does this. Psychoanalysts don't do this. But I think the general is you don't need anti-psychiatry. It's an obvious movement in a kind of relation to the abuse of the mental health discourse, right? But if you can do mental health, which is identification and improvement, and there's lots more important things to improve in the world besides mental health. Mental health is one of them, but like you can do this operation, which is kind of simple, which is the defining and improvement of something somehow, like surplus value. Like how are we going to improve society, right? All the surplus value is going to reproduce capitalism, but instead it could be, you could do an operation where it doesn't do that, or it does this less, or you change the means so it, becomes radically different, right? So that's my view of clinical practice, which I don't usually talk about, but this was a nice segue.
It's interesting.
I'm glad we got to talk about clinical practice a little bit today, because a lot of times we get caught in the theory. But yeah, I think it's important to realize it isn't a perfect divide, right? I think Samo's work, like a lot of your work, is to kind of show the Mobius strip, right? And I think maybe this was a good discussion insofar as we're getting into that Mobius strip of clinical practice in theory.
Yeah, I mean, as a last question, Samo, I just wonder what you think about this. Say we take this kind of we do what's necessary, I guess, and not think about clinical practice and theory as separate things. Do you still have the sense that I think is clear in Marx and Lacan and the Capitalist Unconscious? I don't know how many years it's been since you wrote that, but do you still have a sort of feeling of, I mean, hope is not the right word, but do you have a sense still that there is a strong strand of anti-capitalism, and that psychoanalysis can and will play a role in this important critique of this libidinal economy of capitalism, or has your sort of feelings and views changed a lot along with the political scene over the last sort of however long it's been, 5 to 10 years?
No, I think I think psychoanalysis is one of the rare fields where I remain optimistic. Everything else is going to hell, but at least I think there will be there will always be clinicians who are aware of the impact of their practice, and as Lacan said, renew its the function it has in the world, and I think these are mainly names that we don't necessarily hear about, and they're not outspokenly political and write columns in right-wing journals or daily press and so on, because they're aware that psychoanalysis is also a form of activism. I mean that's how I understand. That's how I understand it. And just to react to what you said, Eliot, I had to think about. Another quote by Lacan. He said at some point, the question is not whether psychoanalysis is a science or not, but what is a science that includes psychoanalysis. And I think this can be definitely repeated also in relation to the very idea of mental health. It's not about whether psychoanalysis should pursue the renewal of mental health or not, but how does the very analytic process change our understanding of mental health? Again, challenging this idealization of optimized, socially productive, burnout-free subjectivity, which is impossible in a universe in which the function of labor is to consume the subject, to exhaust the subject, to push the laboring subjectivity in the state of a burnout. I mean, this is the vicissitude of labor since. Before Marx, this was already an object of insight, but with Marx, I think it obtained a very systematized theoretical expression, and not only in Marxism, also in feminism, also in anti-colonial theory, and so on and so forth. I think they all end in psychoanalysis, and they all circulate around this. Sorry to drop this predicate again: antisocial function of labor in capitalism.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a great point. I mean it's great. We could talk forever, but I mean I think we covered so much, and I think this idea of psychoanalysis as activism is a nice kind of point to finish on, and the possibility that can combat this anti-socialism in capitalism. There's a lot of isms, but it's been great to talk to you, Samo. And we've people obviously have read your books, but we really recommend The Labour of Enjoyment and Marx and the Marx and Lacan book. Is there something new coming out? What's the most recent stuff you're doing?
In the past, since the pandemic, basically I was only working on papers, so there's no book in the pipeline, but hopefully I can sit down in the near future and gather my thoughts on this entire antisociality issue and eventually turn it into a book form.
Yeah, great. That would be great. Well, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks everyone for listening. And we'll see you next week with Ladan Dolar. So carrying on in this kind of vein. So goodbye, everyone. See you soon.
Thanks to you both for having me here.
Thanks for joining us.
Coming on.
Great.
Definitely.
Cheers.